Baby saw a German shepherd trapped in a car wash tunnel. What happened next touched everyone's hearts. What happened next will shock you. A 5-year-old boy made a discovery that changed everything. If you're watching from anywhere around the world, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment below about where you're listening from. The story you're about to listen to started on the worst kind of afternoon. Rain hammered against the windows of the small house on Maple Street like angry fists. Thunder rolled across the sky, making the whole world feel dangerous and wild. Inside the cozy kitchen, 5-year-old Danny sat at the table, his chin resting on his hands, watching the storm through the glass. "This rain just won't quit," his Aunt Sarah muttered, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Her gray hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and worry lines creased her forehead. Danny's parents had left that morning for his grandfather's funeral 3 states away. They wouldn't be back until tomorrow night. Danny pressed his nose against the cool window. The street outside looked like a river. Water rushed down the gutters, carrying leaves and trash in a wild dance. He could barely see the old buildings across the street through the gray curtain of rain. "Can I go outside?" Danny asked, his breath fogging the glass. Aunt Sarah dropped her spoon with a clatter. "Absolutely not! This storm is dangerous, sweetie. The power lines could fall, and there's flooding everywhere." She walked over and pulled the curtain shut. "Besides, you know what I told you about that old car wash on Sycamore Street? It's been closed for years, and the whole structure is falling apart. The city keeps saying they'll tear it down, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. Danny had heard this warning before. The abandoned car wash sat just 2 blocks away, its broken neon sign hanging at a crazy angle. All the kids at school said it was haunted, but Danny didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in adventures. "But what if someone needs help?" Danny asked, his voice small and curious. Aunt Sarah knelt down beside his chair and took his hands in hers. Her fingers were warm and soft, smelling like the lavender lotion she always used. "Danny, listen to me. Bad things can happen in storms. Roofs cave in, walls collapse, and the water can sweep people away. Promise me you'll stay inside until your parents get back." Danny nodded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the curtained window. Something about the storm called to him. Maybe it was the way the thunder sounded like a giant's footsteps, or how the lightning lit up the sky like camera flashes. He'd always been the kind of kid who found worms after rain and rescued cats from trees. "I promise, Aunt Sarah," he said, crossing his fingers behind his back. The afternoon crawled by like a lazy cat. Danny colored in his superhero coloring book, built a tower with his blocks, and watched cartoons on the fuzzy television. But every few minutes, his eyes would wander to the window. The rain was getting lighter now, changing from angry hammering to gentle pattering. The thunder moved further away, like a monster going to sleep. By 4 o'clock, the storm had almost stopped. Only a soft drizzle remained, making everything outside look clean and shiny. Aunt Sarah had fallen asleep in her recliner, her knitting needles still in her hands and a half-finished scarf draped across her lap. Her breathing was deep and steady, the way people breathe when they're really tired. Danny looked at her sleeping face, then at the front door, then back at her. His heart started beating faster. He knew he shouldn't go outside. He knew Aunt Sarah would be scared if she woke up and found him gone. But something stronger than fear was pulling him toward that door. He tiptoed to the coat closet and pulled out his bright red raincoat. It was still damp from yesterday's walk to the grocery store, and it smelled like rain and rubber. He zipped it up to his chin and pulled the hood over his messy brown hair. His sneakers squeaked softly on the hardwood floor as he crept toward the door. The doorknob felt cold under his small hand. He turned it slowly, carefully, holding his breath. The door opened with the tiniest creak, and cool, wet air rushed into the house. It smelled like wet leaves and fresh earth and something else. Something wild and free. Danny stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The world looked completely different after the storm. The street was covered in puddles that reflected the gray sky like mirrors. Tree branches hung low, heavy with water that dripped steadily onto the sidewalk. Everything felt quiet and new, like the earth was taking a deep breath. He started walking toward Sycamore Street, his red coat bright against the gray afternoon. Water splashed under his feet with each step, and he couldn't help but smile. This was exactly the kind of adventure he'd been hoping for. The old car wash came into view as he turned the corner, It looked even more broken than usual after the storm. The roof sagged in the middle, and one of the garage doors hung off its tracks. Rusty water dripped from everywhere, creating a symphony of tiny splashes and plinks. The whole structure looked like a giant's broken toy, abandoned and forgotten. Danny was about to walk past when he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. A sound that didn't belong with the dripping water and settling metal. A sound that made his heart skip a beat. It was whimpering, soft, scared, and coming from inside the dark tunnel of the car wash. Danny's first instinct was to run back home. Aunt Sarah's warnings echoed in his head like alarm bells. But the whimpering came again, weaker this time, and he knew he couldn't leave. Someone or something was in trouble, and he was the only one here to help. He walked closer to the entrance, his sneakers crunching on broken glass and debris. The tunnel stretched, ahead of him, like a hungry mouth, filled with shadows and the smell of old soap and rust. Broken sprinkler heads hung from the ceiling like dead spiders, and puddles of murky water covered the floor. "Hello?" Danny called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Is someone there?" The whimpering stopped for a moment, then started again, more urgent this time. Danny pulled out his phone, a simple flip phone his parents had given him for emergencies. Its small screen cast a weak blue light into the darkness. He took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately, and the smell of dampness and decay grew stronger. His footsteps echoed strangely, multiplying until it sounded like an army of children walking beside him. 20 feet into the tunnel, Danny's light caught something that made him gasp. There, trapped against the far wall by a collapsed piece of machinery, was the biggest dog he'd ever seen. A German shepherd with thick matted fur and intelligent brown eyes that reflected his phone's light like tiny stars. The dog's back leg was caught under a twisted metal frame that had once held rotating brushes. Dark water swirled around its body, and Danny could see patches of blood on its fur. But what struck him most was the look in the dog's eyes. Not just pain, but a deep, intelligent sadness that seemed to say, "I thought no one would ever find me." "Oh no," Danny whispered, his heart breaking. "You're hurt." The dog's ears perked up at his voice, but it didn't try to bark or growl. Instead, it just watched him with those sad, hopeful eyes. Danny could see it was a beautiful animal, even covered in mud and foam. Its coat was black and tan, and despite everything, its tail gave the tiniest wag when Danny spoke. Danny looked around the tunnel, his mind racing. The metal frame was heavy, too heavy for him to lift alone. But he couldn't just leave the dog here. What if the water level rose? What if the rest of the building collapsed? "It's okay," he said softly, kneeling down in the cold water. "I'm going to help you. My name is Danny. What's your name?" The dog whined softly as if trying to answer. Danny noticed something glinting around its neck, a collar, but it was so covered in mud and debris that he couldn't read any tags that might be there. "I'm going to call you Rex," Danny said, remembering his favorite book about a brave dog. "Is that okay?" Rex's tail wagged a little stronger, and for the first time since Danny had found him, the dog's eyes seemed to brighten. It was as if giving him a name had given him hope. Danny examined the metal frame more carefully. It was part of an old car wash brush system, with heavy metal arms that had once spun to clean cars. The whole thing had collapsed during the storm, and one of the arms had Rex pinned by his hind leg. "This is going to hurt a little," Danny said, his voice gentle but determined. "But I have to get you out of here." He braced his feet against the concrete floor and grabbed the metal arm with both hands. It was cold and slippery, and at first, it wouldn't budge at all. Danny pulled harder, his face turning red with effort. The metal groaned and shifted slightly, but not enough to free Rex. Danny sat back on his heels, thinking hard. He needed leverage, something to help him lift the heavy metal. His eyes scanned the tunnel until they landed on an old mop handle lying nearby. It was wooden and looked sturdy enough to use as a lever. "Hold on, Rex," Danny said, crawling through the water to grab the mop handle. "I have an idea." He wedged the handle under the metal arm and used a piece of concrete as a fulcrum. Physics wasn't something Danny had studied in kindergarten, but he understood the basic idea from playing on seesaws. Push down on one end, and the other end goes up. Danny put all his weight on the mop handle, and slowly, inch by inch, the metal arm began to rise. Rex whined and struggled, sensing his chance at freedom, But just as Danny thought he had it, the wooden handle snapped in half with a sharp crack. Danny fell backwards into the water, and the metal arm crashed back down. Rex yelped in pain, and Danny's heart sank. But he wasn't giving up. Not now. "I'm sorry, Rex," Danny said, scrambling back to his feet. "But I'm not leaving you here." He looked around desperately for something else to use. That's when he spotted it. A metal pipe that had broken off from the ceiling. It was longer and stronger than the mop handle, and it might just work. Danny dragged the pipe over and set it up the same way. This time, he was more careful, applying pressure slowly and steadily. The metal arm began to rise again, and Rex seemed to understand what was happening. The dog pushed with his front legs, trying to pull himself free. "Come on, Rex," Danny grunted, pushing down with all his strength. "You can do it." With a sudden rush of movement, Rex pulled his leg free and scrambled away from the collapsed machinery. Danny let go of the pipe, and it clanged to the floor, echoing through the tunnel like a bell. Rex tried to stand, but his injured leg wouldn't support his weight. Instead, he crawled toward Danny, his tail wagging weakly. When he reached the boy, he did something that made Danny's eyes fill with tears. The big dog gently licked Danny's muddy hand. It was the softest, most grateful touch Danny had ever felt. In that moment, he knew he'd made a friend for life. Rex wasn't just a dog anymore. He was Danny's dog, and Danny was going to take care of him no matter what. "We need to get you out of here," Danny said, scratching behind Rex's ears. "Can you walk at all?" Rex tried again, but his back leg was too damaged. Danny could see it was swollen and probably broken. The dog looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes, and Danny made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I'm going to carry you," Danny said, even though he knew Rex was far too big and heavy for a 5-year-old to lift. "We're going to get out of here together." But as Danny tried to figure out how to move an injured German shepherd, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of car doors slamming outside the car wash. Then voices, adult voices, talking in low, urgent tones. "The tracking signal was definitely coming from this area," a man's voice said. "He has to be in there." "About time we found him," another voice replied. "The boss is getting impatient. We need to retrieve the asset before anyone else finds it." Danny's heart hammered in his chest. Asset? What did that mean? And who were these people? Rex's ears perked up, and he started to tremble, not from cold or pain, but from fear. The dog pressed closer to Danny, as if seeking protection. "It's okay," Danny whispered, barely breathing. "I won't let them hurt you." But deep down, Danny knew they were both in terrible danger, and he had no idea how they were going to escape. Danny's mind raced as the voices grew closer. He could hear footsteps splashing through puddles outside, and the beam of a flashlight swept across the entrance of the tunnel. Rex whimpered softly and tried to crawl deeper into the shadows, but his injured leg made every movement painful. "Shh," Danny whispered, placing his hand gently on Rex's head. "We have to be really quiet." The footsteps stopped just outside the tunnel entrance. Danny held his breath, praying they wouldn't come inside. Through the opening, he could see the silhouettes of 2 men against the gray afternoon sky. One was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket. The other was shorter and stockier, with something that looked like a walkie-talkie in his hand. "Are you sure the signal came from in there?" the shorter man asked, his voice echoing slightly in the tunnel. "This place looks like it's about to fall down." "The GPS tracker doesn't lie," the tall man replied. "He's in there somewhere. We just need to find him before someone else does." Danny's heart sank. GPS tracker? That could only mean one thing. Rex was wearing some kind of tracking device. But why? And who were these men? The tall man stepped into the tunnel, and Danny could see the bright beam of his flashlight dancing across the walls. The light was much stronger than Danny's phone, and it would only be seconds before they were discovered. Danny looked around desperately for a hiding place. To his left was a small maintenance room with a broken door hanging off its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. "Come on, Rex," Danny whispered urgently. "We have to move." Rex understood the danger, even if he couldn't understand the words. Despite his injured leg, the dog began crawling toward the maintenance room. Danny stayed beside him, one hand on Rex's back, the other holding his phone with the light turned off. They made it to the doorway just as the tall man's flashlight beam swept across the spot where they'd been hiding. Danny's heart pounded, so hard he was sure the men would hear it. He and Rex pressed themselves against the back wall of the tiny room, surrounded by old cleaning supplies and broken equipment. "I don't see anything," the tall man called out to his partner. "Maybe the signal's bouncing off the metal in here." "Keep looking," the shorter man replied. "The boss said this dog has evidence that could put us all in prison. We can't let anyone else find him." Evidence? Danny's mind spun with questions. What kind of evidence could a dog have? And what had Rex gotten himself mixed up in? The tall man moved deeper into the tunnel, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth methodically. Danny could hear his boots splashing through the water, getting closer to their hiding spot. Rex trembled against Danny's side, and the boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, trying to comfort him. "It's okay." Danny breathed into Rex's ear, so quietly he could barely hear himself. "I won't let them take you." The footsteps stopped right outside their hiding place. Danny could see the edge of the flashlight beam under the broken door. He closed his eyes tight and prayed harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. "This room's too small for a dog that size," the tall man muttered. "He must be further back." The footsteps moved away, and Danny let out the breath he'd been holding. But they weren't safe yet. The men were still in the tunnel, still searching. Danny looked down at Rex and noticed something he'd missed before. The dog's collar wasn't just muddy. It was torn and damaged, like someone had tried to remove it roughly. And there, barely visible under the grime, was a small rectangular device attached to the collar. The GPS tracker. Danny's hands shook as he reached for the device. It was about the size of a matchbox, with a small, blinking red light. This was how the men had found Rex. As long as he wore this collar, they would never be safe. "I have to take this off," Danny whispered to Rex. "It's the only way." Rex seemed to understand. He held perfectly still as Danny worked at the collar buckle with his small fingers. The leather was swollen from water damage, and the buckle was stiff and difficult to move. Danny's fingers slipped several times, and he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out in frustration. Finally, the buckle came loose. Danny carefully slipped the collar off Rex's neck and held it in his hands. The GPS tracker blinked innocently, unaware that it had just lost its target. Danny had an idea. It wasn't a good idea, and it was definitely dangerous, but it might just work. He crept to the doorway and listened carefully. The men were at the far end of the tunnel now, their voices echoing as they searched behind fallen debris. Danny took a deep breath and threw the collar as hard as he could toward the back of the tunnel. It landed with a splash in a deep puddle, and the GPS tracker's light disappeared under the murky water. "Did you hear that?" the shorter man called out. "Yeah, something fell back there. Let's check it out." Danny heard both men moving toward the back of the tunnel, their footsteps splashing rapidly through the water. This was their chance. "Can you crawl?" Danny asked Rex softly. Rex tested his injured leg and winced, but he nodded in that way dogs do when they're determined to try something. Danny helped support the dog's weight as they crept out of the maintenance room. The tunnel entrance looked impossibly far away, but they had to try. Danny could hear the men talking excitedly at the back of the tunnel. They'd probably found the collar, but it wouldn't take them long to realize it was just a decoy. Step by step, Danny and Rex made their way toward the entrance. The dog was in obvious pain, but he never whimpered or complained. His brown eyes stayed focused on the gray light ahead, and Danny felt a surge of admiration for his new friend's courage. They were halfway to the entrance when disaster struck. Rex's injured leg gave out completely, and he collapsed with a soft thud. The sound echoed through the tunnel, and instantly the men's voices stopped. "What was that?" the tall man hissed. "Someone's in here with us," the shorter man replied. "Turn your light this way." Danny's heart sank as he saw the flashlight beam swinging toward them. In seconds, they would be caught. But Rex had other ideas. Despite his pain, the big dog struggled to his feet and let out a low, warning growl. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and threatening, the kind of sound that made people think twice about coming closer. "That's him!" the tall man exclaimed. "That's the dog!" But instead of running toward them, both men hesitated. Rex might be injured, but he was still a German shepherd, and German shepherds had a reputation for being fierce protectors. In the darkness of the tunnel, he looked huge and dangerous. Danny used their hesitation to his advantage. He grabbed Rex around the chest and half carried, half dragged him toward the entrance. The dog helped as much as he could, but Danny was doing most of the work. "Stop right there!" the tall man shouted, finally overcoming his fear. "That dog doesn't belong to you." Danny didn't stop. He couldn't stop. They were so close to the entrance now that he could feel the cool air on his face. Rex seemed to sense their nearness to freedom too, and he found the strength to take a few more steps on his own. They burst out of the tunnel into the gray afternoon light, and Danny kept running. Behind them, he could hear the men shouting and splashing through the water as they gave chase. "There's a kid with him!" the shorter man yelled. "Just a little kid!" Danny's red raincoat made him easy to spot, but it also made him look even smaller and more vulnerable than he was. He was just a 5-year-old boy trying to help an injured dog, and even these hard men seemed to hesitate about chasing down a child. But their hesitation didn't last long. Danny heard their footsteps pounding on the wet pavement behind him, getting closer. Rex was trying his best to keep up, but his injured leg was slowing them down. Danny looked around desperately for help. The street was empty except for a few parked cars. Most people were still inside, staying warm and dry after the storm. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. That's when Danny saw it, a small alley between two buildings just ahead. It was narrow and dark, and Danny wasn't sure where it led, but it was their only chance. "This way, Rex," Danny panted, turning sharply into the alley. The alley was even narrower than it had looked from the street. Danny had to turn sideways to fit through some parts, and Rex had to crawl on his belly. But the men chasing them were adults, bigger and bulkier, and they would have an even harder time following. Danny could hear them arguing at the entrance to the alley. "He went in there," the tall man said. "We have to follow him." "It's too narrow," the shorter man protested. "We'll get stuck. Then we'll wait at the other end," the tall man decided. "This alley has to come out somewhere." Danny's heart sank. They were trapped. He looked around the alley for another way out, but there was nothing except brick walls on both sides and a chain-link fence at the far end. Rex seemed to sense Danny's despair. The dog nuzzled against the boy's leg and made a soft sound. Not quite a whine, but something gentler. It was as if he was saying, "Thank you for trying." Danny knelt down and put his arms around Rex's neck. The dog's fur was still damp and smelled like soap and rain, but underneath that was something else, something warm and comforting that reminded Danny of home. "I'm sorry," Danny whispered into Rex's ear. "I thought I could save you." But Rex wasn't giving up. The dog pulled away from Danny's embrace and limped toward the chain-link fence. Danny followed, wondering what Rex was thinking. At the base of the fence, there was a small hole where the chain link had been cut or torn away. It was just big enough for a child to crawl through, but too small for an adult. Rex pawed at the hole with his good front paw, then looked back at Danny with those intelligent brown eyes. "You want me to go through?" Danny asked. Rex nodded in that doggy way again, then lay down and began pushing himself through the hole. His injured leg made it difficult, but he was determined. Danny helped guide him through, trying to be gentle with the hurt leg. Once Rex was on the other side, Danny squeezed through the hole himself. His red raincoat caught on the sharp edges of the fence, but he managed to pull free without tearing it too badly. They emerged into another alley, this one wider and cleaner. Danny could see the street at the far end, and beyond that, the familiar sight of Mrs. Chen's flower shop. Mrs. Chen was Aunt Sarah's best friend, and she had known Danny since he was a baby. "We made it," Danny said, hardly believing it himself. But their relief was short-lived. As they limped toward the street, Danny heard the sound of a car engine starting. The men had given up on following them through the alley and were driving around to cut them off. Danny looked at Rex, who was struggling to walk on his injured leg. They would never make it to Mrs. Chen's shop in time, not at this pace. That's when Danny had another idea. It was crazy, but it might just work. "Rex," Danny said, kneeling down beside the dog, "I need you to trust me one more time." Rex looked into Danny's eyes and seemed to understand. Whatever this boy was planning, the dog was ready to follow him. Danny took off his red raincoat and draped it over Rex's back, covering most of the dog's distinctive black and tan markings. Then he put his arms around Rex's neck and began walking slowly toward the street. To anyone watching, it would look like a little boy helping his injured pet. Nothing suspicious about that. They made it to the sidewalk just as a black van turned the corner. Danny's heart hammered, but he forced himself to walk normally, like he was just a kid taking his dog for a walk after the storm. The van slowed down as it approached them. Danny could see two men inside, scanning the area, but they were looking for a boy in a red raincoat and a German shepherd, not a boy helping what looked like a medium-sized mixed-breed dog. The van passed them by and continued down the street. Danny waited until it was completely out of sight before allowing himself to breathe normally again. "We did it," he whispered to Rex. "We actually did it." Rex's tail wagged weakly, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like gratitude and admiration. This little boy had risked everything to save him, and Rex wouldn't forget it. Danny helped Rex up the steps to Mrs. Chen's flower shop, his heart still racing from their narrow escape. But he had no idea that their adventure was just beginning, or that Rex was carrying secrets that would change everything Danny thought he knew about right and wrong. As they reached the door of the flower shop, Danny felt Rex tense beside him. The dog was staring at something in the window, a photograph that Mrs. Chen kept on display among her flower arrangements. It was a picture of a police officer in uniform, standing beside a German shepherd that looked exactly like Rex. The officer was smiling, his hand resting on the dog's head, and there was something familiar about his face. Rex whimpered softly and pawed at the window, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Danny stared at the picture, then at Rex, then back at the picture again. "Rex," Danny said slowly, "do you know that man?" Before Rex could answer in his own way, the door of the flower shop opened and Mrs. Chen appeared. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She looked down at Danny and Rex with surprise. "Danny, what are you doing out in this weather, and where did you find this beautiful dog?" Mrs. Chen's eyes moved from Danny to Rex, and suddenly her expression changed. The color drained from her face, and she took a step backward. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It can't be." She stared at Rex as if she was seeing a ghost. The dog stared back at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and his tail began to wag slowly. "Mrs. Chen?" Danny said, worried by her reaction. "Are you okay?" But Mrs. Chen wasn't listening. She was still staring at Rex, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Storm," she whispered, "is it really you?" Rex's ears perked up at the name, and he took a step toward Mrs. Chen. His injured leg made him stumble, but Mrs. Chen caught him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Oh, Storm!" she cried, burying her face in the dog's fur. "I thought you were dead. We all thought you were dead." Danny stood there, confused and amazed. Storm? That was Rex's real name? And how did Mrs. Chen know him? "Mrs. Chen," Danny said urgently, "there are some men looking for him, bad men. They said something about evidence and putting people in prison." Mrs. Chen looked up at Danny, her eyes still shining with tears. But now there was something else in her expression. Determination and a kind of fierce protectiveness. "Come inside," she said firmly. "Both of you. We have a lot to talk about." As they helped Storm into the warm, flower-scented shop, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something much bigger than just rescuing a lost dog. The photograph in the window, Mrs. Chen's reaction, the men's desperate search, it all added up to a mystery that was just beginning to unfold. And at the center of it all was Storm, the brave German shepherd who had already proven he would do anything to protect the people he loved. Mrs. Chen locked the door behind them and quickly pulled down the window shades. The flower shop, which had always seemed bright and cheerful to Danny, suddenly felt like a secret hideout. The smell of roses and lilies filled the air, but there was tension underneath the sweetness. "Sit down," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing to a small chair near the counter. "Both of you need to rest." Danny helped Storm settle on a soft rug beside the chair. The dog's injured leg was clearly bothering him, but his eyes stayed alert, watching the door and windows like a trained guard. Mrs. Chen disappeared into the back room and returned with a first aid kit and a bowl of water. "Let me look at that leg," she said gently, kneeling beside Storm. The dog allowed her to examine his injury, though he winced when she touched the swollen area. Danny watched in amazement as Mrs. Chen cleaned the wound with practiced movements, wrapping it carefully with gauze and medical tape. "You know how to take care of dogs," Danny observed. Mrs. Chen smiled sadly. "I should. I used to help take care of police dogs when my brother was alive." She gestured toward the photograph in the window. "That's my brother, Officer Michael Chen, and this is his partner, Storm." Danny's eyes widened. "Storm was a police dog?" "Not just any police dog," Mrs. Chen said, her voice filled with pride and sadness. "He was one of the best. Michael and Storm worked together for 5 years, solving cases and keeping our city safe. They were inseparable." Storm's tail thumped weakly against the floor at the mention of Michael's name. Danny could see the love and loyalty in the dog's eyes. Even after all this time, Storm remembered his partner. "What happened to Officer Michael?" Danny asked quietly. Mrs. Chen's face grew dark. "He died 2 years ago. The official report said it was a car accident, but Michael was the most careful driver I knew. He never took unnecessary risks, especially not with Storm in the car." She stood up and walked to the window, peeking through a gap in the shades to check the street outside. Michael had been investigating something big before he died, something involving police corruption and stolen evidence. He told me he was getting close to solving it, but he was worried about Storm's safety. "Why Storm's safety?" Danny asked, confused. Mrs. Chen turned back to them, her expression grave. "Because Storm wasn't just Michael's partner, he was the key witness. Dogs have incredible memories, Danny. They can identify people by scent, sound, even the way they walk. Storm had been present during several important arrests, and he could identify the criminals involved." Danny looked down at Storm with new respect. "So, those men who were chasing us probably work for the same people who killed my brother," Mrs. Chen finished. "They've been looking for Storm ever since Michael died. We thought Storm was dead too. His body was never found after the accident." "But how did he end up in that car wash?" Danny asked. Mrs. Chen knelt beside Storm again, running her fingers through his fur. "I think he's been hiding, surviving on his own for 2 years. He's smart enough to avoid people who might turn him in, but he probably got trapped during the storm." Storm whimpered softly and nuzzled against Mrs. Chen's hand. Despite his size and training, he looked vulnerable and tired. Danny's heart ached thinking about the dog spending 2 years alone, always running, always afraid. "We have to help him," Danny said firmly. "We can't let those bad men find him." Mrs. Chen smiled at Danny's determination. "You're very brave, young man. But this is dangerous. These people killed a police officer. They won't hesitate to hurt a child." Before Danny could respond, they heard the sound of a car engine outside. Mrs. Chen quickly moved to the window and peered through the shades. Her face went pale. "It's them," she whispered. "The black van is parked across the street." Danny felt his stomach drop. "How did they find us?" "They're probably checking every business in the area," Mrs. Chen said, her voice tight with worry. "We need to call the police." She moved toward the phone behind the counter, but Storm suddenly stood up, ignoring the pain in his leg. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and he was staring at the back door of the shop with intense focus. "What is it, Storm?" Danny asked. The dog moved to the back door, his nose pressed against the crack underneath. He sniffed carefully, then let out a low growl that made the hair on Danny's arms stand up. "Someone's back there," Mrs. Chen said, understanding immediately. "They're surrounding the building." Danny's heart raced. They were trapped with nowhere to run. But Storm had other ideas. The dog limped to a door that Danny had never noticed before, a narrow door tucked behind a display of potted plants. "That leads to the basement," Mrs. Chen said, "but it's just storage down there." Storm pawed at the door insistently, then looked back at them with those intelligent brown eyes. Danny was beginning to understand that when Storm had an idea, it was usually a good one. "He wants us to go down there," Danny said. Mrs. Chen hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "If Storm thinks it's safe, then that's where we go." She opened the basement door, and they all hurried down the narrow wooden stairs. The basement was dimly lit and filled with boxes of flower supplies, but it felt secure and hidden. Mrs. Chen locked the door behind them. "Now what?" Danny whispered. Storm was already exploring the basement, his nose working overtime. He stopped at the far wall and began pawing at what looked like a loose board. "What's he doing?" Mrs. Chen asked. Danny knelt beside Storm and examined the wall more closely. The board wasn't just loose, it was deliberately designed to be moved. Behind it was a small opening, just big enough for a person to crawl through. "Mrs. Chen," Danny said excitedly, "I think Storm found a secret passage." Mrs. Chen came over to look, and her eyes widened with surprise. "I had no idea this was here. This building is over 100 years old. There might be tunnels that connect to other buildings. Above them, they heard the sound of heavy footsteps and voices. The men had entered the flower shop. "Mrs. Chen," a gruff voice called out. "We know you're in here. We just want to talk." Mrs. Chen and Danny looked at each other. They both knew these men wanted to do more than just talk. "We need to go through the passage," Mrs. Chen whispered. "Now." Storm went first, squeezing through the opening despite his injured leg. Danny followed, and Mrs. Chen came last, pulling the loose board back into place behind them. The passage was dark and narrow, clearly built in an era when people were smaller. Danny's phone provided the only light, casting eerie shadows on the brick walls. The air smelled old and dusty, like secrets that had been buried for decades. They crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Danny could hear Storm ahead of him, moving with surprising grace despite his injury. Behind him, Mrs. Chen breathing was steady, but tense. Finally, Storm stopped. Danny bumped into the dog gently and saw that they had reached another opening. This one led into what looked like another basement, but this one was cleaner and better lit. They emerged into the basement of the building next door, a small cafe that Danny recognized. He'd been here with his parents many times for hot chocolate and cookies. "This is amazing," Danny breathed. "Who built these tunnels?" "Probably bootleggers during Prohibition," Mrs. Chen said, brushing dust off her clothes. "This whole area was full of speakeasies in the 1920s. Storm was already at the bottom of another set of stairs, his tail wagging slightly. Despite everything they'd been through, the dog seemed almost excited by their underground adventure. They climbed the stairs carefully and found themselves in the back room of Rosa's cafe. The cafe was closed for the day, but Mrs. Rosa lived in the apartment upstairs. Mrs. Chen knocked gently on the door that led to the apartment. "Rosa, it's Linda Chen. I need your help." A few moments later, the door opened to reveal a plump woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. Mrs. Rosa took one look at Danny, Mrs. Chen, and Storm, and immediately stepped aside. Come in," she said in her thick Italian accent. "You look like you've seen trouble." As they explained the situation, Mrs. Rosa's expression grew more and more serious. She'd known Officer Michael Chen and had always suspected there was more to his death than the official story. "These corrupt cops, they think they can do anything," Mrs. Rosa said angrily. "But they don't know Rosa Benedetti. I've been dealing with bullies since I was 6 years old in Sicily." She moved to her kitchen window and peered down at the street. "I can see the van. 2 men are still searching the flower shop. But there's something else." Danny and Mrs. Chen joined her at the window. Down on the street, Danny could see a police car pulling up behind the black van. 2 uniformed officers got out and approached the men. "Real police," Mrs. Chen said with relief. "Someone must have called about suspicious activity." But their relief was short-lived. As they watched, one of the uniformed officers shook hands with the man from the black van like they were old friends. The officers looked around casually, then got back in their car and drove away. "Corrupt cops," Mrs. Rosa said grimly, just like Michael suspected. Danny felt a chill run down his spine. If they couldn't trust the police, who could they trust? Storm seemed to sense their despair. The dog moved to the window and stared down at the street with intense focus. Suddenly, his ears perked up, and he began to whine softly. "What is it, Storm?" Mrs. Chen asked. The dog was staring at something across the street, a figure walking quickly down the sidewalk. It was a woman in a dark coat, moving with purpose and confidence. She looked up at the cafe window for just a moment, and Danny caught a glimpse of her face. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with short blonde hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. But what caught Danny's attention was the small pin on her coat lapel, a badge that looked official but wasn't a regular police badge. Storm's tail began to wag furiously. He pawed at the window and whined more urgently. "He knows her," Mrs. Chen said with surprise. "Storm recognizes that woman." The woman on the street seemed to notice Storm's reaction. She looked up at the window again, and her eyes widened when she saw the German Shepherd. She glanced around quickly, then pulled out her phone and made a call. "Should we be worried?" Danny asked. Mrs. Chen studied the woman carefully. "I don't think so. Look at Storm. He's happy to see her, not afraid." The woman finished her phone call and walked into the cafe. A few minutes later, they heard her voice downstairs, talking to Mrs. Rosa in hushed but urgent tones. "Mrs. Rosa, the woman was saying. "My name is Detective Sarah Morrison with Internal Affairs. I'm investigating the corruption case that Officer Michael Chen was working on before he died." Danny, Mrs. Chen, and Storm looked at each other. Internal Affairs. That meant she was one of the good guys, investigating corrupt cops from within the police force. "I've been tracking those men in the black van for weeks," Detective Morrison continued. "They're part of a group that's been stealing evidence and intimidating witnesses. I think they're looking for Michael's partner." Mrs. Rose's voice carried up the stairs. "You mean Storm? The police dog?" "Yes. Storm was present during several arrests that these corrupt officers are trying to cover up. If we can find Storm, he can help us identify the criminals and bring them to justice." Mrs. Chen made a decision. "We need to talk to her," she whispered to Danny. "If she's really investigating Michael's case, she might be our only hope." Danny nodded, though his stomach was churning with nerves. They'd been running and hiding for hours, and he was exhausted. But Storm needed their help, and they needed allies. Mrs. Chen called down the stairs. "Detective Morrison, could you come up here, please? There's someone you need to meet." A few moments later, Detective Morrison appeared at the top of the stairs. She was younger than Danny had expected, with kind eyes and a confident manner. When she saw Storm, she stopped in her tracks. "My God," she breathed. "It's really him. It's really Storm." Storm approached her cautiously, sniffing her extended hand. After a moment, his tail began to wag, and he allowed her to pet his head. "I worked with Michael on several cases," Detective Morrison explained. "Storm saved my life once when a suspect tried to attack me during an arrest. Michael always said Storm was the best judge of character he'd ever met." She knelt beside the dog and examined his injured leg with gentle hands. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" Storm whined softly and licked her hand, and Danny could see the trust building between them. "Detective Morrison," Mrs. Chen said, "those men who are looking for Storm, they killed my brother, didn't they?" Detective Morrison's expression grew grim. "I believe so. Michael was getting close to exposing a network of corrupt officers who were stealing drugs and money from evidence lockers. He had gathered enough proof to put several people in prison, but he died before he could present his case. And Storm was part of that evidence," Danny said, beginning to understand. "Storm was present during the arrests of several key suspects," Detective Morrison confirmed. "Dogs can't testify in court, but they can identify suspects in lineups. Storm's identification could corroborate Michael's evidence and help us convict the right people." Danny looked down at Storm, who was resting peacefully for the first time since their adventure began. The dog looked tired but alert, and there was something in his eyes that looked almost like hope. "So what happens now?" Danny asked. Detective Morrison smiled. "Now we make sure Storm is safe, and we finish the work that Michael started. But first, we need to get away from those men downstairs." She moved to the window and looked down at the street. The black van was still there, but the men seemed to be getting frustrated. They'd searched the flower shop thoroughly and found nothing. "I called for backup before I came in," Detective Morrison said. "Real backup. Officers I trust completely. They should be here any minute." As if summoned by her words, 3 police cars turned onto the street, their lights flashing, but their sirens silent. The cars surrounded the black van, and officers jumped out with their weapons drawn. Danny watched in fascination as the 2 men from the van were arrested. They tried to argue and show some kind of credentials, but the arresting officers weren't buying it. "Those credentials are fake," Detective Morrison explained. "We've been tracking this group for months. Today, thanks to you and Storm, we finally caught them red-handed." Storm's tail wagged as he watched the scene below. It was as if he understood that justice was finally being served for his fallen partner. "Is it over?" Danny asked. "Is Storm safe now?" Detective Morrison scratched behind Storm's ears affectionately. "It's far from over. We still need Storm's help to identify the other members of this corruption ring. But yes, he's safe now. These particular bad guys won't be bothering him anymore." She looked at Danny with genuine admiration. "And you, young man, are a hero. Storm wouldn't be alive if it weren't for your bravery." Danny blushed and looked down at his muddy shoes. "I just couldn't leave him there." "That's what makes you a hero," Detective Morrison said. "You did the right thing even when it was dangerous." Storm limped over to Danny and rested his big head against the boy's leg. In that moment, Danny felt a connection deeper than friendship. It was the bond between two souls who had faced danger together and emerged stronger. But as Danny looked into Storm's loyal brown eyes, he had no idea that their adventure was about to take one more unexpected turn. Because Storm's story was bigger than anyone had imagined, and the truth about Officer Michael Chen's death was more shocking than even Detective Morrison suspected. Detective Morrison was helping Storm down the stairs when her phone buzzed urgently. She glanced at the screen and her face went pale. "What is it?" Mrs. Chen asked, noticing the detective's worried expression. "We have a problem," Detective Morrison said, her voice tight with concern. "My captain just called. Someone higher up the chain is trying to shut down this investigation. They're saying we don't have jurisdiction to arrest those men." Danny felt his stomach drop. "But you just arrested them. We saw it happen." "Politics," Detective Morrison said bitterly. "Someone with power is protecting these corrupt cops. We might have to let those men go." Storm whined softly as if he understood that their victory was being stolen from them. Mrs. Chen put a protective hand on the dog's head. "There has to be something we can do," she said desperately. Detective Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking hard. Then her eyes lit up with an idea that was either brilliant or completely crazy. "There is one thing," she said slowly. "But it's dangerous, and it would require Storm to do something very brave." "What kind of something?" Danny asked. "We need irrefutable proof of the corruption," Detective Morrison explained. "Something so clear and obvious that even the people protecting these criminals can't ignore it." She knelt beside Storm and looked into his intelligent eyes. "Storm, I know you remember the night Michael died. You were there, weren't you?" Storm's ears flattened against his head, and he whimpered softly. The memory was clearly painful for him. "I've been studying the accident report," Detective Morrison continued. "Michael's car went off the road at Hillcrest Bridge, but the skid marks never made sense. They showed Michael was trying to avoid something, not that he lost control." Mrs. Chen gasped. "You think someone forced him off the road?" "I think Michael was meeting someone that night," Detective Morrison said. "Someone he thought he could trust. And Storm witnessed the whole thing." Danny looked down at Storm, who was trembling slightly. The dog had been carrying this terrible secret for 2 years, unable to tell anyone what he'd seen. "How does that help us now?" Mrs. Chen asked. Detective Morrison pulled out her phone and showed them a news article. "There's going to be a police memorial service tomorrow night at Hillcrest Bridge. It's the 2-year anniversary of Michael's death. All the officers involved in the corruption case will be there, including the ones who killed him." Danny's eyes widened. "You want to take Storm there? If Storm sees the person who killed Michael, he'll react," Detective Morrison explained. "Dogs don't lie, and they don't forget. His reaction will be caught on camera by the news crews covering the memorial." "That's incredibly dangerous," Mrs. Chen protested. "What if they try to hurt Storm?" "They won't expect us to bring Storm out in the open," Detective Morrison said. "They think he's just a scared, injured dog hiding in abandoned buildings. They don't know he's been taken care of, or that we know the truth." Storm stood up slowly, favoring his injured leg. He walked to the window and stared out at the street where the corrupt officers had been arrested and then mysteriously released. There was something determined in his posture, as if he was making a decision. "I think Storm wants to do it," Danny said quietly. "I think he wants justice for Michael." Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes. "Michael always said Storm was the bravest dog he'd ever known. But this could get him killed." "Not if we're smart about it," Detective Morrison said. "I have a plan." She explained her idea carefully. They would attend the memorial service like any other mourners. Danny would be there with his pet dog. Storm would be disguised to look like a regular family pet instead of a police K9. Detective Morrison would position herself with a camera to record everything that happened. "When Storm sees the killer, we'll have our proof," Detective Morrison concluded. "And this time, no one will be able to cover it up because it will all be caught on live television." Danny felt scared and excited at the same time. This was bigger than anything he'd ever been part of, but Storm needed their help. The dog had saved Danny's life in that car wash tunnel, and now it was Danny's turn to help save Storm. "I'll do it," Danny said firmly. "Storm and I are a team now." Mrs. Chen looked worried, but she nodded slowly. If this is what it takes to get justice for my brother, then we have to try. Detective Morrison smiled grimly. Then we have work to do. First, we need to make Storm look like a regular pet instead of a police dog. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Rosa helped them give Storm a bath to wash away the last traces of mud and soap from the car wash. Mrs. Chen found an old collar and leash that would make Storm look like a beloved family pet. Detective Morrison arranged for a veterinarian friend to properly treat Storm's injured leg. As the sun began to set, Danny sat beside Storm in Mrs. Rosa's living room. The dog looked completely different now, clean, well-fed, and wearing a bright blue collar instead of his old police gear. But his eyes still held that same intelligence and determination. "Are you scared?" Danny asked Storm softly. Storm looked at him with those deep brown eyes and made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but something gentler. It was as if he was saying, "I'm scared, but I'm brave too." Danny understood exactly how he felt. Detective Morrison checked her watch. "It's time. The memorial service starts in an hour, and we need to get into position." They made their way to Hillcrest Bridge as the last light faded from the sky. The bridge was beautiful in an eerie way, arching high over a deep ravine with a river running far below. Tonight, it was decorated with flowers and candles in memory of Officer Michael Chen. News crews had set up their cameras, and dozens of police officers in dress uniforms stood at attention. Danny recognized some of them from newspaper photos: the police chief, several captains, and other high-ranking officers. "Remember," Detective Morrison whispered to Danny, "Storm might react strongly when he sees the killer. Stay calm and keep him close." Danny nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel Storm's tension through the leash. The dog was alert and focused, scanning the crowd of uniformed officers with intense concentration. The memorial service began with speeches about Michael's bravery and dedication. Danny listened to the words, but he was watching Storm. The dog showed no reaction to most of the speakers. His ears stayed relaxed, and his breathing remained steady. Then Police Chief Harrison stepped up to the microphone. Storm's ears perked up slightly, but his body language remained calm. This wasn't the person they were looking for. Captain Rodriguez spoke next about Michael's commitment to justice. Again, Storm showed mild interest, but no strong reaction. Danny was beginning to wonder if their plan would work. Finally, Deputy Chief Williams approached the podium. He was a tall man with graying hair and a kind face. Danny had seen his picture in the newspaper many times. He was known for his community outreach programs and his reputation as one of the good guys. The moment Deputy Chief Williams began to speak, Storm's entire body went rigid. The dog's ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. His hackles rose, making him look twice as big as before. Storm tried to surge forward, but Danny held him back with the leash. "Easy, Storm," Danny whispered, but his own heart was racing. This was it. This was Michael's killer. Deputy Chief Williams was talking about the importance of honor and integrity in police work, but Storm wasn't listening to his words. The dog was focused entirely on the man's scent, his movements, the sound of his voice. Every instinct Storm possessed was screaming that this was the enemy. Detective Morrison, positioned with the news crews, was recording everything. The cameras caught Storm's reaction perfectly. There was no mistaking the dog's recognition and fury. But Storm wasn't finished. As Deputy Chief Williams continued his speech about justice and truth, Storm did something that shocked everyone. The dog let out a howl, not the howl of a pet dog, but the trained alert call of a police K9 who had found his target. The sound cut through Deputy Chief Williams' speech like a knife. Every head in the crowd turned toward Danny and Storm. Williams himself stopped mid-sentence and stared at the German Shepherd with an expression that went from confusion to recognition to terror in just seconds. "That's impossible," Williams whispered into the microphone, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "That dog is supposed to be dead." The admission hung in the air like a smoking gun. Williams realized immediately what he'd said, but it was too late. The news cameras had caught every word, and Detective Morrison was smiling grimly as she recorded. Storm's howl had done more than identify a killer. It had made the killer confess on live television. The crowd began to murmur in confusion. Other officers looked at Williams with suspicion, and several of Detective Morrison's trusted colleagues began moving closer to the deputy chief. Williams tried to recover. I heard rumors that Officer Chen's dog had died in the accident. I didn't know. But Storm wasn't letting him off that easily. The dog broke free from Danny's grip and bounded toward the podium, his injured leg barely slowing him down. His training took over as he cornered Williams exactly the way he had been taught to corner suspects. Williams backed away from the podium, his face pale with fear. "Get that animal away from me!" "He's not an animal," Danny called out, his young voice carrying clearly in the night air. "He's a hero, and you killed his partner." The crowd gasped. News reporters began shouting questions, and camera flashes lit up the night like lightning. Detective Morrison stepped forward with her badge displayed. "Deputy Chief Williams," she said loudly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Officer Michael Chen." Williams tried to run, but Storm was faster. The dog positioned himself between Williams and his escape route, growling with a sound that promised he wouldn't let the killer escape again. Other officers moved in to help with the arrest, and Williams finally realized he was trapped. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked at Storm with pure hatred. "That dog has been nothing but trouble from the beginning," Williams snarled. "Michael never should have trained him so well." It was another confession, caught on camera for the world to see. As Williams was led away, Storm limped back to Danny. The dog was exhausted from the emotional ordeal, but there was something peaceful in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Justice had finally been served. Detective Morrison knelt beside Storm and scratched behind his ears. "You did good, boy. Michael would be so proud." Danny wrapped his arms around Storm's neck, feeling the dog's steady heartbeat against his chest. They had done it together. A 5-year-old boy and a brave police dog had brought down a corrupt killer who thought he was untouchable. The news crews surrounded them, asking questions and taking pictures. Danny felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but Storm stayed calm and protective beside him. "How did you know?" a reporter asked Danny. "How did you know the dog would react that way?" Danny looked down at Storm, then back at the reporter. "Storm isn't just any dog. He's a police officer just like his partner was, and police officers never give up on finding the truth." The story of the boy and the police dog who exposed a killer would be front-page news across the country. But for Danny and Storm, the most important thing was that they had kept their promise to each other. As they walked away from the bridge, leaving the chaos of arrests and interviews behind them, Danny felt Storm lean against his leg. The dog was tired, but he was also content in a way he hadn't been for 2 years. "What happens now?" Danny asked Detective Morrison. She smiled and looked down at Storm. "Now Storm gets to retire with honor. He's done his duty and he's earned his rest." Danny's heart sank. "Does that mean I can't see him anymore?" Detective Morrison exchanged a look with Mrs. Chen, who had been watching the whole scene with tears of pride in her eyes. "Actually," Mrs. Chen said, "I think Storm has already chosen his new family." Storm's tail wagged as he looked up at Danny with those loyal brown eyes. The dog had found more than justice tonight. He had found a new purpose and a new friend who would love him for the rest of his life. But their story wasn't quite over yet, because as they walked home through the quiet streets, none of them noticed the black car following at a distance, or the man inside it, who was very angry that his carefully constructed cover-up had just been destroyed by a boy and a dog. The next morning, Danny woke up to the sound of Storm's gentle breathing beside his bed. The German Shepherd had refused to sleep anywhere else, positioning himself like a guardian between Danny and the bedroom door. In the soft morning light, Danny could see that Storm's injured leg was healing well, though he still walked with a slight limp. Danny's parents had returned from the funeral the night before, just in time to see their son on the evening news. His mother had cried when she heard the whole story, and his father had shaken Storm's paw with the seriousness of someone meeting a genuine hero. "Good morning, Storm," Danny whispered, sitting up in bed. Storm's tail thumped against the floor, and he stretched like a cat before patting over to nuzzle Danny's hand. The dog looked more relaxed than Danny had ever seen him, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Downstairs, Danny could hear his parents talking quietly in the kitchen with Aunt Sarah and Mrs. Chen. The smell of bacon and coffee drifted up the stairs, making Danny's stomach rumble. He and Storm had been through so much in the past few days that normal things like breakfast felt almost magical. "Come on, boy," Danny said, getting dressed quickly. "Let's see what's happening." When they reached the kitchen, Danny found a scene that warmed his heart. His mother was making pancakes while Storm sat patiently nearby, not begging, but clearly hoping for a taste. His father was reading multiple newspapers spread across the table, each one featuring photos of Danny and Storm from the night before. "There's our hero," his mother said, turning to give Danny a hug. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Danny thought about the question seriously. He felt tired, excited, proud, and a little scared all at the same time. But mostly he felt grateful that Storm was safe. "I'm good," he said. "Is Storm really going to stay with us?" His father looked up from the newspapers with a smile. "That depends on Storm. Detective Morrison says he's officially retired from police duty, which means he can choose his own family now." As if he understood every word, Storm walked over to Danny and sat down beside him, resting his big head against the boy's leg. The message was clear. Storm had already made his choice. Mrs. Chen, who was sitting at the table with a cup of tea, wiped tears from her eyes. "Michael would be so happy to know that Storm found a family who loves him." "What about Deputy Chief Williams?" Danny asked. "Is he really going to prison?" His father's expression grew serious. "He's been arrested and charged with murder. The evidence against him is overwhelming, especially after his confession on live television. But Danny, there's something else we need to talk about." Danny felt his stomach tighten. "What?" Detective Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking tired but determined. She'd been working all night, following up on leads and making arrests. "We caught 3 more corrupt officers," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from Danny's mother. "Williams wasn't working alone, but there's one person we haven't found yet, the person who was coordinating the whole operation." Storm's ears perked up at Detective Morrison's voice, and he wagged his tail. The dog clearly trusted her completely. "What does that mean for us?" Aunt Sarah asked. "It means you need to be careful for a while," Detective Morrison said. "This person might try to retaliate. We're posting officers outside your house, and Storm will be the best protection Danny could have." Danny looked down at Storm, who seemed to understand that he still had a job to do. The dog's eyes were alert and watchful, ready to protect his new family. "How long do we have to be careful?" Danny's mother asked. "Hopefully not long," Detective Morrison said. "We have leads and we're getting closer. Williams is cooperating now, trying to reduce his sentence by giving us information." She knelt beside Storm and scratched behind his ears. "This brave dog has given us everything we need to clean up the corruption in our police department. We owe him a debt we can never repay." Storm's tail wagged, but his attention was suddenly focused on something else. His ears swiveled toward the front of the house, and he let out a low, warning growl. Everyone in the kitchen went silent. Danny felt his heart start to race again. "What is it, Storm?" Detective Morrison asked quietly, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon. Storm padded to the front window and peered through the curtains. His growl deepened, and the hair on his back stood up. Detective Morrison joined him at the window, being careful to stay hidden behind the curtain. What she saw made her face go pale. "Everyone get away from the windows," she said urgently. "Now!" Danny's father immediately moved Danny and his mother toward the back of the house. Mrs. Chen and Aunt Sarah followed quickly. But Storm remained at the window, his body tense and ready. "What's out there?" Danny's father asked. "A man with a gun," Detective Morrison said, pulling out her phone to call for backup. "He's sitting in a car across the street, watching the house." Danny felt ice-cold fear wash over him. Just when he thought they were safe, the danger had found them again. Detective Morrison was speaking rapidly into her phone, coordinating with other officers. "We need backup at 1247 Maple Street. Armed suspect watching the house." "Yes, this is related to the Williams case." Storm suddenly left the window and came to Danny's side. The dog positioned himself between Danny and the front door, his eyes never leaving the entrance to the house. "How long until help arrives?" Danny's mother asked, her voice tight with worry. 5 minutes, Detective Morrison said. "Maybe less." Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Everyone stayed in the back of the house, away from the windows. Danny's father had his arm around Danny's mother, and Aunt Sarah held Mrs. Chen's hand. Detective Morrison kept watch, her weapon ready. Storm never moved from Danny's side. The dog's presence was oddly comforting. Danny knew that nothing would get past Storm to hurt him. Finally, they heard the sound of police sirens approaching. Through the back window, Danny could see police cars surrounding the house. There was a lot of shouting outside. but it was too muffled to understand. Detective Morrison's phone rang. She answered it quickly. "Morrison here? Yes, we're all safe. You got him? Good. Any resistance? I understand. We'll stay inside until you give the all clear." She hung up and turned to the family with a relieved smile. They arrested him. No shots fired. He didn't even try to run. Danny felt his legs go weak with relief. "Is it really over now?" "This part is," Detective Morrison said. "The man they just arrested is Marcus Webb, the mastermind behind the corruption ring. He was William's boss and the one who ordered Michael's murder." Storm's ears relaxed, and he sat down beside Danny with a contented sigh. Somehow, the dog seemed to know that the real danger had passed. Over the next hour, police officers came and went, taking statements and securing the area. Detective Morrison explained that Webb had been desperate to eliminate the last witness to his crimes, Storm. But now that Webb was in custody, the entire corruption network had been dismantled. "Storm can live in peace now," Detective Morrison said, kneeling beside the dog one last time before leaving. "He's earned his retirement." Storm looked up at her with those intelligent brown eyes, then at Danny, then back at Detective Morrison. It was as if he was saying goodbye to his old life and hello to his new one. After Detective Morrison left, the house felt quiet and peaceful for the first time in days. Danny's parents were making plans for Storm's future: a dog bed, toys, regular vet checkups, and all the things a beloved family pet would need. But Danny knew Storm would never be just a pet. He would always be a hero, a guardian, and a friend who had taught a 5-year-old boy what courage really meant. That evening, as the sun set over their quiet neighborhood, Danny sat in the backyard with Storm. The dog's injured leg was healing well, and he seemed content to just lie in the grass and watch the world go by. "Storm," Danny said softly, "do you miss being a police dog?" Storm looked at him with those wise brown eyes and made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but something gentler. It was as if he was saying, "I loved my old job, but I love my new family more." Danny understood completely. Sometimes the best adventures led you exactly where you needed to be. Mrs. Chen visited that evening, bringing a special gift: Michael's police commendation medals. She'd decided that Storm should have them, as a reminder of his service and sacrifice. Michael would want Storm to have these, she said, fastening one of the medals to Storm's new collar. He always said Storm was the bravest officer he'd ever worked with. Storm sat perfectly still as she attached the medal, as if he understood the honor he was receiving. When she was finished, he gently licked her hand, a final goodbye to his past and a promise to honor Michael's memory. As the weeks passed, Danny and Storm became inseparable. The dog walked Danny to school each morning and was waiting at the gate each afternoon. Storm learned to play fetch, though he approached it with the same serious concentration he'd once applied to police work. Danny taught Storm new tricks, but the dog taught Danny something far more valuable: that courage wasn't about not being scared, but about doing the right thing even when you were terrified. The story of the boy and the police dog made national news. Danny received letters from children all over the country, telling him their own stories of helping animals and standing up for what was right. Storm received honorary citizenship from the city and a lifetime supply of his favorite dog treats. But the best reward was the quiet moments: Storm sleeping beside Danny's bed, the two of them exploring the neighborhood together, and the way Storm's tail wagged every time Danny came home. 1 year later, on the anniversary of their first meeting, Danny and Storm returned to the old car wash. It had been torn down and replaced with a small park, complete with a playground and a memorial bench dedicated to Officer Michael Chen and his faithful partner. Danny sat on the bench with Storm beside him, thinking about how much their lives had changed. He was 6 now, a whole year older and wiser. Storm's gray muzzle showed his age, but his eyes were still as bright and intelligent as ever. "Do you ever think about that day?" Danny asked Storm. Storm looked at him with those familiar brown eyes and made a soft sound that seemed to say, "Every day, and I'm grateful for every moment since then." A year later, Danny was helping Storm up onto the memorial bench when he noticed a small plaque that hadn't been there before. It read, "In memory of all the brave souls who stand up for what's right, no matter how small they may be." Danny smiled and scratched behind Storm's ears. They had started as strangers in a dangerous situation, but they had become family through courage, loyalty, and love. As they walked home together, Danny reflected on everything Storm had taught him. He'd learned that heroes come in all sizes, that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it, and that the best friendships are forged in the fires of shared adversity. Storm had found justice for his fallen partner and a new family who loved him. Danny had found a best friend and a protector who would stand by him no matter what challenges lay ahead. Their adventure had ended, but their story together was just beginning, because some bonds are stronger than time, deeper than danger, and more lasting than any obstacle life can throw at them. That night, as Storm settled into his favorite spot beside Danny's bed, the dog let out a contented sigh. He was home, he was loved, he was safe, and he was exactly where he belonged. Danny reached down to pet Storm's head one more time before falling asleep. "Sweet dreams, hero," he whispered. And in the peaceful quiet of their home, both boy and dog slept soundly, knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures, but they would face them together. If you've been listening to this story from anywhere in the world, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and comment below about where you're from. Stories like Danny and Storm's remind us that courage and friendship can change everything, and heroes are found in the most unexpected places.